We're on the record.
Well, back in session. Just a couple of matters before our jury returns. We're waiting just for one more jury. We will break early today at 3:30. We did discuss jury instructions yesterday, and I do have a few more revisions in the works. I gave you a suggestion of where I'm going, but there'll be more probably by the end of the day. I did want to take this opportunity to address Mr. Durst on the question of gratuitous answers to questions not posed. There is a legitimate concern that either by question or by non-responsive answer that Mr. Durst might mention specific evidence that has been excluded in this case, and that evidence includes any evidence of someone taking a polygraph test. It would include evidence of Mr. Durst undergoing any kind of psychiatric treatment or receiving some sort of mental health diagnosis. It also would involve descriptions of hearsay statements by persons whose statements are not admissible. There's no exception. So, not to foreclose the defense, if there is some new theory for admissibility of any of these things, you might bring that to my attention outside of the presence of the jury. You ask to go sidebar, and I will hear you out, of course. But I want to make it clear, I know Mr. DeGuerin will not ask such questions, but I'm instructing you, Mr. Durst, not to mention these subjects. You won't be asked about them without permission, and they would not respond to legitimate questions. So if you hear a question, pause for a moment until you answer, because there may be an objection. I may sustain that objection. If I overrule the objection, you may go ahead and answer that question, answering only the question that was posed. Do you understand that, Mr. Durst?
I understand.
Thank you, Mr. Durst. That's the court's order. Our jurors, anything else, counsel?
Your Honor, there was one.
We do want to revisit that at the appropriate time, Your Honor, under evidence code 1250.
We will speak at the appropriate time. I've invited you. Yes.
There's one more issue that's also at this point in time, it's inadmissible, and that is specific as an example in Galveston. Mr. Durst testified about an alleged killing by Morris Black in Okinawa some years before, etc. So in other words, any evidence or information regarding prior acts of violence by Mr. Black, at this point in time, Your Honor, and unless and until the court rules differently, that would be the same rule as well, as our understanding.
I took that evidence as an example of braggadocio rather than as actual evidence of a killing. But Mr. DeGuerin, it's that it seems like a legitimate objection.
It's not the truth of the matter asserted, but it goes to Mr. Durst's state of mind and the legitimacy and reasonableness of his fear of Mr. Black.
Well, what about that, Mr. Lewin? If he authentically believed that Morris Black had killed a man, then perhaps if he were defending himself, he might take more aggressive measures.
Well, the problem with that is that in the end, Mr. Durst's version of what happened, if in fact Morris Black pulled the gun on him and that there was a struggle, it doesn't matter what Mr. Durst thinks about Morris Black's prior conduct. In other words, Your Honor, if someone is pointing a gun at you, there is no issue regarding, well, this person has done X before. So in essence, that is gratuitous information that is simply being presented to the jury. That's what happened in Galveston, to try to impugn Mr. Black's character. And again, as the issue is pretty clear, Your Honor, if the jury believes that Mr. Durst's story, if it's the same story as he gave previously, of self-defense where Morris Black is pointing a gun at him, then under 352, there simply is no legitimate reason why that evidence, why its probative value would not be substantially outweighed by its prejudice.
I don't think so. I'd overrule that objection. Okay, when we have our jurors, we'll commence before morning. Thank you. Thank you. Durst. Mr. Durst is present. Mr. DeGuerin and Mr. Chestnut, Mr. Lewin, Mr. Daly, and Mr. Milius. And Mr. Henderson and Mr. Miata all present. For the people, we're going to go until 3:30 today. So we're both today and tomorrow. We're finishing a little early, just to alert you to that. So why don't we roll right into it, Mr. Chestnut? Jurors and alternates all being present. Chestnut. Oh, Mr. It's just wishful thinking, as I enjoy.
Well, thank you.
No,
Well, thank you, Your Honor.
No, but Mr. DeGuerin, please. Sorry.
May I?
Please take a seat near the defendant.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to take up where we left off yesterday, but first I want to give you an opportunity to correct something that you said yesterday in the timeline about when Susan Berman moved to New York. Were you incorrect in what you said yesterday?
Well, yesterday I said when Kathy and I traveled around the country in a van, we stopped in San Francisco and we saw Tommy Durst and we saw Susan Berman. And then when I rethought it, I corrected myself and said I couldn't have seen Susan Berman if she was in New York. Well, now I'm going to correct myself again. Susan Berman did not move to New York until 1976. So in 1973, we did see her in San Francisco, and my recollection the first time around was correct.
All right,
Okay.
let's fix that microphone. Is that the one that was feeding back, Mr.
I think
Daly?
so. Can I try to turn the volume up?
Please do. Let's adjust it so Mr. Durst can be heard.
You know, just so there's no confusion, I know that this was unintentional. Mr. Durst referred to,
Mr. Durst
DeGuerin
finds
referred
these
to what happened
microphones
yesterday.
very difficult.
Is that better? Is that audio?
I think he's audible now. But we'll try that out. You may remain for the next question
Okay.
and answer.
And I
Yeah,
think-
see, yesterday, just as I was confused saying come back the next day, Mr. Durst was confused saying that was yesterday. We had this space and time where we worked on the jury instructions and it was outside of time.
I started that because I said yesterday.
Right. That's okay. We all understand that he's referring to the first day of his testimony. You may continue.
So, is that when Kathy and Susan first met?
No, they had met before that. They had met when Susan had visited New York a couple of times. They liked each other.
That was my next question, did Susan and Kathy become friends?
They become very close friends. Kathy saw Susan as another big sister.
Okay, so we're at the point where you and Kathy had developed your store in Vermont, but then you felt that you needed to come to New York because your father wanted you to. Is that right?
Yes.
And did you and Kathy make an agreement about leaving Vermont and coming to New York?
Well, we discussed it constantly And we finally, Kathy went along with what I wanted to do, which was to move to New York and try working in the family business. And Kathy accepted that we would go to New York for a couple of years as the maximum, and I would decide if I liked working in the family business, which we both sort of expected I would not like. So then we were planning on, after a year or two, moving back to Middlebury, Vermont.
You mentioned to the jury yesterday that you and Kathy had bought some land near Middlebury, and your plans for that were what?
We were going to build a house there. We had met with architects, and we had sketches for a house about 20 minutes from Middlebury in the White Mountains. Very pretty.
Had you and Kathy also discussed, at the time you married and soon after that, whether you would have children?
We were always discussing whether we would have children. From probably 6 months after we met, and Kathy moved to Middlebury, Vermont to be with me, we talked about getting married, and we talked about not having children, but not having children. And I was very, very much against having children. I felt that I was too much of a responsibility. I did not want to be a daddy. My childhood had been a disaster. I did not want the same thing to happen to my child.
Well, how old was Kathy during this time?
19. And when I look back on it, thinking that this 19-year-old girl, woman, would give up everything she always planned on. All just like that. Kathy had 3 older sisters. They all got married, had children, became housewives. Kathy babysat for all of them. And that's what Kathy had planned on doing her whole life. And when I think about it now, the way she just kind of, well, then we won't have children, gave up on it. I look back on it as being totally unreal. I couldn't have just accepted it. Clearly, Kathy was not going to just accept not having children.
Okay. You say you look back on it now. Do you think that was a mistake on your part?
Well, then I run into the question of, should I have wanted to have children? Was I making a mistake by ruling children out? Or was I making a mistake of thinking that Kathy would be able to live her life and not have children and be happy?
Nonetheless, at the beginning of your relationship, that you and Kathy agreed that you would not have children.
Say that again.
I said, nonetheless, at the beginning of your relationship, did you and Kathy come to an agreement that you would not have children?
Yes.
All right. So you moved to New York to go back to work in the Durst organization for a trial period of about 2 years. Is that right?
I was planning on a couple of years, yes.
Were you looking forward to that?
No.
So where did you and Kathy move when you came back to the New York area?
We lived in two places. We had part of Dad's big house in Katona. We had one of the wings there. My brother Douglas was in the other wing with his wife and two children. We also took a floor in one of my family's townhouses in Manhattan, and we put furniture, and we would stay there whenever we wanted to stay overnight in Manhattan.
The house in Katona where you moved, your father's house in Katona, with Douglas and his wife in one wing and you and Kathy in another wing, did that work out very well?
No, that was a mistake.
Why was
Douglas's wife, Susanna, very strong person and very cold. And she saw Kathy and I as being interlopers in her house. The fact of the matter is, it was Seymour's house. It was not their house, but they kind of took over. And I would spend my days working in the business. And Kathy was all alone with Susanna Durst and having a very bad time of it.
So did Kathy not get along with Susanna Durst, Douglas's wife?
I think that's a double negative, but they did not get along at all. And Susanna Durst was definitely the stronger personality. The longer we stayed in New York, the more Kathy started liking her life in New York other than living with Douglas and Susanna.
When you say liked her life in New York other than living with Douglas and Susanna, are you speaking of the apartment that you had in New York City?
No, I'm thinking that Kathy, who had decided she wanted to become a nurse, had visited nursing programs throughout northern Westchester and adjacent Connecticut, and had decided that she would try going to college. She would be the first one in her family to go to college. But she found a program at Western Connecticut State College. Connecticut has 4 state colleges. Connecticut has the University of Connecticut and 4 state colleges: Eastern, Southern, Northern, and Western. Western had just opened. It was a brand new, very small college, but they had a nursing program whereby you go to college for 4 years and you get a Bachelor of Science, and you would also get a registered nurse certificate, so you could immediately go to work as a nurse, and you had a Bachelor of Science degree. So Kathy was liking going to school, and Kathy had made friends. The only thing Kathy did not like was living with Douglas and Susanna.
So, for some of the jurors that may not be familiar with the geography of New York and Connecticut and Westchester County and Manhattan, tell the jurors, as far as Katona was concerned, was it a reasonable distance to Western Connecticut State College?
About half an hour.
So was it convenient for Kathy to go to nursing school while you were commuting to Manhattan for your work?
Yes, Kathy would drive half an hour north I would take an hour and 15-minute train ride south to Manhattan.
Okay, so what train would you take?
What train?
Yes.
It was called the Harlem Line.
And did it have a station in Katona?
Yes.
All right, we'll get to that station later in the sequence of events. But was it the situation where Kathy would drive to college and you would go to Manhattan on the train?
Correct.
And so what part of the day of the week would that consume for Kathy in school and you in Manhattan?
Well, I would go all day. I would take like a 7:15 train to get to the Grand Central Station around 8:30, and then walk 15 minutes to the office. Kathy would drive half an hour, and depending upon her schedule, would depend on how much time she spent at school.
Let's talk for just a few minutes about Kathy in nursing school and college. As I understand it, it was a combined curriculum where she would study for her Bachelor's of Science, but also for her nursing degree. Is that right?
Yes, it was one of them. There were lots of nursing programs around, and there were just a few colleges that had nursing programs. So the advantage of doing the one at college was that in addition to becoming a registered nurse, you would get a Bachelor of Science degree.
How was she doing in school?
Real good.
Was Kathy smart?
Yes.
How did you feel about her pursuing this nursing career?
Oh, I thought it was great.
At the same time, how are you doing in your work at the Durst organization?
Well, I was gradually learning how to do things, but I wasn't loving it. I was barely liking it. All real estate involved a lot of meetings with strangers, and the way the Durst organization was set up, 2 or 3 days a week, there would be some kind of a luncheon for some charitable organization. And usually one night a week, there would be a dinner. I did not like hanging out with all these strangers.
Did you commute back to Katona, your father's house, every night, or did you sometimes stay in New York City?
Infrequently, we would stay in New York City.
Would Kathy join you there?
Depending on what was going on with her life in school, sometimes she did not want to go to New York City when I was having one of my dinners. So then she would stay in Katona, and I would stay in the city.
Now, give the jury an idea of what years we're talking about. What years were you, did this routine go on, where Kathy would go to nursing school and you would go to Manhattan?
1971 and a half.
All right, well, you married in 1973.
Right.
So when did you start, and let me put it this way, when did Kathy start nursing school?
1971.
Okay. So when did you and Kathy acquire the South Salem cottage?
Well, that was it. Kathy kept trying to get me to buy a house. I kept thinking, I don't think I'm going to stay and work in the Durst organization, so I don't want to buy a house. So we kind of were total inertia. We were in the house in Katona with Douglas and Susanna, and we couldn't make up our minds if we were going to stay in New York or go back to Vermont. Kathy gradually wanted to stay in Vermont, stay in Katona, and go to nursing school. And I gradually kept trying to put off making a decision about working in the Durst organization. So that involved putting off buying a house.
But was the living situation tolerant in you and Kathy staying in your father's house with Douglas in the other wing and his wife?
We put up with it. In 1973, we decided to get married. And once we decided to get married, I pretty much gave up the idea that we were going to move back to Vermont right away. I thought maybe we would do it in the future. But for the time being, I'm going to marry Kathy, and we're going to buy a house, which turned out to be the South Salem house. And I'm going to put up with working in the family business.
Okay, so when did you and Kathy acquire the South Salem cottage?
About a year after we got married,
So in
1974.
All right. Briefly describe for the jury what the South Salem cottage was like.
Very small, 1,100 square feet, of which 300 were pretty much in the basement, which was the second bedroom. The upstairs was 800 square feet. Everybody considered it to be a cottage.
What about the neighborhood?
Nice neighborhood.
Was there a small private lake nearby?
Yeah, we were on a lake. It was a small lake, but it was big enough to go fishing and to have sailboats. The lake did not allow people to have motorboats because they felt the oil would kill all the vegetation.
So did you have a boat?
We, like everybody else, had several boats. We had a canoe and we had a sailboat, a tiny sailboat. Everybody's first sailboat was called a sailfish. I can't remember who the manufacturer was, but it was made out of balsa wood, covered with canvas, and it had a boom and a rudder, and you could take that and go around the whole lake in an hour.
Did you and Kathy sail on that lake?
Yeah,
Is that lake called, what's the name of the lake?
Lake Truesdale.
And did you use your canoe there?
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
Well, put it this way, did you enjoy living, at least part-time, at the South Salem cottage?
Yes, what I should have brought up, what we mostly did in the lake was go swimming.
Okay. So I want to step aside for a moment and talk about Susan. Susan was living in San Francisco when you first moved first acquired the South Salem cottage, correct?
Correct.
But you told us day before yesterday that there was a point where Susan decided to move to New York, and she at first stayed with you and Kathy in the spare bedroom. Is that right?
She stayed with us in the townhouse in Manhattan, and she took the second bedroom, and she was there about 6 months.
And describe for the jury how that worked out.
Well, we only used her. Talking to the jury makes me nervous.
Okay.
We only use the house in the city infrequently, so usually Susan was there by herself. But Susan and Kathy had always gotten along real well. So when we did stay overnight in the city, there was no problem. We went out and did things. Susan was all the time inviting us here and inviting us there. Susan knew everybody.
Okay. What was Susan doing in New York? Why was she there?
She had pretty much written her novel, her life story. She had an editor, and she was talking to publishers to get somebody to publish her Susan Berman's life story.
You said novel. Was it fiction or was it her life story?
It was her life story.
And how long did that take?
Well, she worked on it every day. She went frequently to the central reading room at the New York City Library and worked on it there, which was a couple of blocks from where we lived. And Susan, as always, made lots of friends.
And again, for those who might not know much about the layout and the geography of New York City, where was your apartment, or where was your townhouse in relation to the New York Central Library?
Objection relevance 352.
Overruled. You may answer.
It was about 10 blocks away.
Is that walking distance in New York City?
Easy walking distance.
Okay.
And from going to different publishers, Susan had made lots of friends. So she would go to the library and meet with publishers and editors, make changes to her, I don't know whether to call it her life story or her book or whatever.
What was the name of the book?
Easy Streets.
What significance is the title, Easy Street? Do you know what it means?
It was her growing up in Las Vegas in 1950s and how her father and the various gangsters raised their children.
That's the subject matter, but do you know the significance of the title, Easy Street?
Objection relevance 352.
I'll allow this.
You may answer.
Well, I don't know the significance.
Okay. So did she get it published?
Eventually, Random House bought the rights to publish it, and Random House provided an advertising budget, but the advertising budget was a lot less than what Susan felt she needed. So one of the things that I did was I agreed to give her a book party, so that when the book actually came out, and we're jumping ahead now Because the book that actually did not get published until 1980.
Okay, you said you agreed to supplement the advertising budget and also to give her a book signing party, and that came a little bit later, I understand that. Let's see a photograph that we've already seen in this trial. It's our number 9, please. And I'm not sure what the People's Exhibit number is. Oh, well, not 9, I'm sorry.
We're not going to...
Number 14.
You don't go by numbers, you have letters. So
I understand. Now, I'm saying that for Mr. Garcia's benefit.
I see. You've labeled it as your 14, and Mr. Milia, we'll show that to Mr. Milia so he can find it and identify it as a People's Exhibit also.
What is 302?
No, hold on. I think it's number 3.
Your Honor, at a break, we'll start showing these so they can match the numbers, so we don't take the time now.
All right. We'll mark it in a bit.
It's 76C, Your Honor.
Thank you.
I'm
People
sorry?
76.
76?
Yeah.
76C.
Pardon?
C?
C is in cat.
C is in cat. 76C is in cat, Your Honor.
76C.
I guess we have to look at this one.
Oh, there we go.
If you pan out a little bit, there we go. The jury's seen this before, Bob, but would you explain to us what we're looking at?
That was at the book party. That was me. During a brief period of time, I decided to have a beard, and Susan in the middle, and Kathy at the end.
And what year was that?
1980.
Okay. Where was that?
Well, Susan decided not to have her book party at an expensive place, but to have it something called Sammy's Romanian Steakhouse, which was Jewish food.
And where was it located?
Greenwich Village.
And again, that's in kind of the lower part of Manhattan,
Objection relevance.
Overall.
the lower part of Manhattan.
Yes.
Was it a good, happy event?
Well, it was great for Susan, but it was not great for Kathy. This was the first time I had ever seen Kathy drink so much that she lost control of herself. She fell down and gashed her head. I took her to St. Vincent Hospital emergency room, who put some stitches in her head, and then I took her home. She, of course, wanted to go back to the party with the top of her head shaved, but I sort of convinced her that would be a mistake. So I went back to the party.
Okay. and we kind of jumped ahead a little bit. I want to talk about Kathy and her schooling at Western Connecticut College, pursuing both a Bachelor's of Science and her nursing certificate. What were the years in which she was attending school at Western Connecticut?
1972 to 1978.
Did she graduate?
Yes. But I need to step back. In 1976 was the bicentennial. And New York did something called the Tall Ships. And they got old sailing ships around the country and put on a big party sailing the ships up Hudson River.
All right, that was 1976. What happened of significance then?
We went and walked to the Hudson River, which was absolutely mobbed. You could stand along the side, but there were people everywhere. Kathy started complaining about a headache, and within a couple of hours, it was very evident that something was very wrong. Kathy looked white as a sheet. When I put my hand up at her temple, I could feel it pulsing. From Kathy's minimal education in nursing that Kathy had, Kathy could say that she knew there was something going on in her spine.
So what did you do next when you saw that she was ill and she said that she was ill and something was going on? What did you do next?
Well, then,
Sustain.
It's important.
Important?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so the first answer is non-responsive, so you asked a question which triggered a story, all right, to which there was no question pending. And now you're asking a question about something with the relevance of which you've not described to me.
We can do it at sidebar, or?
Yes, okay, let's do that.
Mr. Washington, is it possible to move this one? Is it in my face? It's a little better. Yes, that's much better.
All right, Mr. DeGuerin, you may resume your question.
Let's move this point by point, Bob. Was there a point in time when Kathy made a decision she wanted to go to medical school?
Yes.
What did this event have to do with that you just started to describe?
So we were standing by the Hudson River with a mob all around us. And Kathy started getting sick. And she was hot, and her temple was throbbing. And she said, when this happens, I know from my nursing school that it means something's wrong with my spine. So we wanted to go to an emergency room. It must have taken us 45 minutes to walk 2 blocks to where the crowd would thin out so we could get a taxi. We went to hospital for special surgery. They were the nearest hospital. We walked into the emergency room, and as soon as the intern saw Kathy, he immediately said she needs to be an inpatient. Kathy was diagnosed as having spinal meningitis. Spinal meningitis, a terrible disease, but it basically had been wiped out in America and in Europe and in other rich places. They started asking me questions about whether or not we had recently visited one of a number of African countries that I had barely heard of, which of course we had not done. They never did figure out how Kathy got spinal meningitis. What they do is they have to anesthetic, general anesthesia, and they poke a hole in the spine and they let the excess fluid flow out.
Their objection.
So was she treated there at the
352,
special?
sorry.
Objection overruled.
So was she treated at this hospital for special surgery?
She was there for 3 days. When she got out of the hospital, she was sure she wanted to become a doctor. So this was 1976, and she'd been going to nursing school for 3 years about.
So did she finish her schooling at Western Connecticut, the nursing program, the Bachelor's of Science program?
Yes, and what she did was she delayed her graduation for 2 years so that she could take the courses necessary to apply to medical school. In order to get an RN, you have to take a lot of sciences, but not nearly as many sciences as you need to take to apply to medical school.
So I've heard the term pre-med as an undergraduate course. Is that basically what happened? She switched to pre-med?
Well, whatever you call it, I don't know that Western Connecticut State College had a specific pre-med program, but just from getting the catalogs to the various medical schools, you could tell what sciences you needed to have completed in order to apply to medical school. Kathy started taking those extra courses, and since it did not make sense to graduate and get the nursing degree and then find out whether or not she could get into medical school, she just delayed graduating from Western Connecticut State College.
Okay, so as I think you said, her graduation was put off for a couple of years so she could take these extra courses. During that time, was she planning, and did she apply to medical schools?
Yes, and applying to medical school is a big deal. The applications are lengthy, and you've got to write several essays.
Did you support her in that effort?
Of course.
Were you proud of her?
Yes, I mean, applying to medical school, I thought it would be great if she could get into medical school. I was not optimistic, but I did not let her see that I was pessimistic.
Was there an occasion when you and Kathy had supper with your father, Seymour?
Yes, we saw Seymour periodically. What we would do most weeks was fill out an application for medical school. It could take 2-3 hours. And then we would mail it, and then we would celebrate. So we told Dad one night, about our routine of applying to medical schools 1 a week.
As far as you know, did your father know before that dinner you're about to describe, did your father know before that that Kathy was applying to medical school?
No, we just brought it up. He asked, we were talking about what we were doing, and one of the things we were doing was applying to medical school. And I think by the time we got around to telling Dad, Kathy had applied to 8 or 9 medical schools. So it came up at dinner, and Dad said, "Have you applied to Albert Einstein?"
Did you know about Albert Einstein Medical School at that time?
Vaguely.
All right. Did
So
you know that,
Kathy said,
let me stop you a second. Did you know whether or not the Durst family or the Durst organization or your father or your grandfather had any connection to Einstein?
that's all I knew. I knew that my grandfather, Joseph Durst, was the quote-unquote founder of Albert Einstein Medical Center. I have no idea how much you had to donate to be a founder, but we're talking about substantial dollars. So when Kathy brought up, Dad said, "Have you applied to Albert Einstein?" Kathy said that she was doing the easiest ones first, that Albert Einstein, and she mentioned another medical school, Cornell Presbyterian, were considered the 2 best in the New York area. So Kathy was applying to the easiest ones first, and she hadn't gotten to Albert Einstein yet. So Dad said, "Apply to Albert Einstein, and I will call Jack Weiler."
Who was Jack Weiler?
Jack Weiler was 1/2 of the biggest real estate firm in New York City at the time. It was called Swig Weiler, and they operated both in New York City and in San Francisco. And at this time, in the 70s and 80s, they were clearly the largest real estate firm in New York City.
Did you know whether Mr. Weiler had any connections with Albert Einstein at that time?
Miss Jack Weiler was the largest donor to Albert Einstein. So when Dad called him up and said, "My daughter-in-law has applied to Albert Einstein," I don't know where the conversation went, but I believe that that is the reason Kathy was eventually accepted at Albert Einstein.
You're not sure of that. You don't know that for sure.
No, I don't know that.
Did Kathy get accepted at any of the other colleges or medical schools that she had applied?
Objection,
So the
Rutledge,
only
Your Honor.
place she was accepted was
Objection.
Albert Einstein.
Overlook. I'll allow it.
Okay. So, it's okay. It's done. How did you and Kathy take the news that,
We celebrated.
okay, I want to show you another photograph that I believe has already been shown. We're calling it the Bob and Kathy graduation photo, number 9 for Mr. Garcia.
Your Honor, it was People's 15, but ours is a little more cropped, so perhaps we should give it a
H?
number.
Are we on the H now, or defense H?
Can you see that, Bob?
I can see it.
What are we looking at?
What am I? That was a graduation. It was the second year that Western Connecticut State College had a graduation class.
And Kathy appeared to be holding something. What is that?
She's holding whatever it is they give you when you graduate.
Had you already, at the time
Why
of,
don't they stop cutting the picture?
I'm sorry?
The picture I'm looking at cuts us off at our foreheads.
Well, that's just the way it's formatted on the screen. Maybe we can do something about that, somebody, please? Okay. Had Kathy already received her acceptance for Albert Einstein when she graduated from Western?
Yeah, that's what happened. In March of 1978, Kathy got accepted at Albert Einstein. So it was supposed to be a graduation party that we had in June of 1978 turned out to be a party celebrating Kathy's admission to Albert Einstein.
How did you feel about that when it happened?
I was ecstatic.
And Kathy? How did she feel?
Well, I mean, she was ecstatic too.
And her family?
Her family couldn't believe that their littlest daughter was going to be a doctor.
Okay. So now Kathy gets enrolled in Albert Einstein College. How did she do her first year?
The first 2 years of medical school are the most difficult things anybody can do. The first year is all anatomy, the parts of the body. They don't have telephone books anymore, but Kathy had these books with tissue paper pages in them describing all the parts of the body and the names for everything. I remember looking at one of them for the hand. There were about 10 pages.
Objection relevance 352.
So you may object to questions that call for a relevant answer. The problem here is whether it is responsive. I'm not sure that it's responsive. Hold on.
My objection was on relevance 352, not on it.
Yes, but it was not a contemporaneous objection. It has to be contemporaneous with the question. So how did she do her first year is the question. This is not responsive to the answer. You may move to strike it.
Let me
I'll strike
rephrase. Was the first year difficult?
Yes, the first year was extremely difficult. Besides going to school, Kathy would go home. We had rented the apartment at 12 East 86th Street. She would go back to the apartment and sit in her room all day and all night.
That's what I was going to ask you about, the routine, how your life and the routine in your life changed with this first year in medical school. First, where did you begin living?
When she got accepted at medical school, it was apparent to us that it made no sense for us to commute from the South Salem house, both of us to commute to the city. So that's when we decided we needed to rent an apartment or buy an apartment. But we rented at 12 East 86th Street, a 2-bedroom pre-war apartment. They all look pretty much the same, a square layout.
And for those jurors who don't, again, know the geography of Manhattan and the Bronx and the location of Albert Einstein, was this a much closer place to live to Albert Einstein than where you had stayed in South Salem for one thing, but also your other apartment?
From Albert Einstein to 12 East 86th Street, it's about 10 miles. It could take forever, or when there was no traffic, it would take 10, 15 minutes.
What about the subway?
No subway went anywhere near the two of them.
Okay. But was it more convenient than living in South Salem?
Well, enormously.
So what did you do? Kathy's going to medical school now. You're still working in the Durst organization. What did you do?
I would take the bus down Fifth Avenue to 43rd Street and then walk to 6th Avenue where our office was.
Okay. So now let's step aside. Where was Susan Berman now? This is 1978, right?
So Susan Berman was in New York. She had bought an apartment on a street called Beekman Place, Beekman Place. And she was keeping busy, as Susan Berman always did.
Did you and Kathy and Susan see each other?
Very frequently. Kathy's first year in medical school, mostly I saw Susan just as us, because Kathy would be studying.
Okay.
You want to take a break now?
That'd be fine.
We'll break until 10:30, ladies and gentlemen. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. We'll see you at 10:30.